Welcome to today's episode of the Positive Leadership Podcast. Today, we are joined by leading experts in the field of cross-cultural communication and leadership. Our guest is someone who's had a profound impact on how organizations understand and navigate cultural differences in the workplace. She's a professor at INSEAD, where she teaches one of the most sought-after courses on the complexity of managing across cultures. She's the author of the highly acclaimed book, The Culture Map. A wonderful book, by the way, which I read, which is considered obviously as a must-read for anyone working in international or cross-cultural context. She's also the co-author of No Rules Rules, alongside Netflix CEO Reed Hastings, a book that explores how the company's radical culture of freedom and responsibility has led to its success. Her expertise has made her a trusted advisor to global leaders and companies like Airbnb, Google, and many others. Our guest today is Erin Meyer. Erin, thank you so much for joining us.
So nice to be here with you.
So Erin, it's a pleasure to reconnect with you after a few years. When we met, I was still leading our global sales at Microsoft.
That's right.
And traveling the world for 30 years of my life. So I'd like to start my episode usually asking for your roots. And could you please share a little bit about basically where you came from and who and what has influenced your early years in your life?
Okay. Yep. So let me just reiterate as I get into this that, so as you know, I study how people conduct business most effectively in different parts of the world. So cross-cultural management, but I am from a very monocultural place. So I was raised in the Midwest of the U.S. in Minnesota. I was born in the northern U.S. in northern Minnesota in Two Harbors, it was called. Okay. And I think just a little anecdote to kind of illustrate how monocultural my upbringing was. When I was in high school at Minneapolis South High, my least favorite class was French. And
really?
That's true. And I remember I just thought it was so useless. And I just had this I would complain to my friends, it's not like I'm ever going to meet a French person. A little ironic given that I've been in France 24 years now.
Yes, indeed.
I did meet a couple of them.
So you persevere with your French, obviously.
Well, we had to, at my school, there were two languages. There was there was Spanish and French. Okay, and my brother was taking Spanish, so that left French for me. But then I went on to undergrad, and I studied. I needed to continue. Literally, that was all. I just continued with French because I needed it for my major.
Of course, right? that's the only reason.
All right, but now I realize it was the most useful class that I took in high school.
What about your family in terms of parents, their influence, their background, and the way they kind of raised you? Yes. Yeah.
So my parents were psychologists. My parents actually, to tell the story. Yeah, both of them. That's right. And my parents actually were from California. Oh. They moved to Minnesota to live off the land, to have this kind of like natural back to earth experience. So they were psychologists, but also anthropologists. So although I come from a very modest background, we used to travel to remote places.
To research and study?
My parents were just interested in it. So we would go to like other people, maybe they would go to Mexico and go to Cancun, but we would go to Mexico and go to some kind of little village where my father could visit a local shaman. Right? I grew up, although in a very monocultural place, I grew up with this kind of interest in human beings around the world. And I guess that's what later on became my fascination.
No, for sure. So to what extent, again, your family, but maybe some other people as well, who've been either mentors or friends, have influenced your academic, accomplishments and what you studied and what you decided to do finally?
Yeah, so how I got into this field was that after undergrad, I joined the Peace Corps.
Yes.
And so that's for your non-American listeners, that's the volunteer organization where you go and live in another country. The country is chosen by the government, right? By the Peace Corps in the U.S.
Yes.
And so I went to Botswana, and it was while I was there that I became so interested in seeing how children are motivated so differently in different cultures, and how the teacher, which of course later on is reflective of what we look for in leadership, right?
Sure. Yep.
But how the teacher leads the classroom so differently. I mean, all of the techniques that I'd learned about positive leadership.
We'll come back to that
about
later.
positive leadership in a classroom.
Positive teacher.
All right. I mean, they just fell flat, right? It was like all the things that we were doing in the U.S. in order to engage the students, like that didn't work at all.
Were you a teacher yourself?
I was a teacher, yeah.
A teacher of what?
I was teaching English
not French.
No. Oh my gosh, no. In a very remote school.
Wow.
So they were just, the kids actually came to school barefoot, right?
Yeah.
So I was teaching in a very remote school, and we just, sometimes we taught classes outside, actually.
Yeah.
We had the kids sitting around. They had like little benches. Yeah. So in any case, at the end of all of that, I was trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do with my life now?
Yeah.
And I worked through, I don't know if you are aware of this book, but this book, What Color is Your Parachute? Which is an American, I mean, at that time, it was all about that was the book if you wanted to figure out what to do with your life. Okay. And at the end, it told me that I should study cross-cultural management.
Really?
That's true.
The book itself?
Well, no, but you work through activities, right? So
like
it gives you like activities, and at the end, so you make like lists and you circle things, bring things together. And at the end, you get like a couple of options of what to do with your life.
So it's like a previous version of the Ikigai, or the American version of the Ikigai.
That's right.
Japan,
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, not as needed anymore now that we have the internet.
But before we go there, Erin, if you don't mind, I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on Botswana, because I'm sure the remote village back many decades ago must have been very special. Any special moment touching in terms of the kids, the families, that left you with some lasting impressions on why this teaching role was so critical and what you learn out of it? Yeah,
I mean, I think what was so fundamental was to see the level of commitment to these children, and not all of them, but the children who, I mean, like the amount that they would give to the classrooms was actually more than I had seen in the U.S. And it was quite touching. Yes. It was quite touching to see that level of commitment. So that's what made me want to later go on to be a professor.
To be a professor.
Yeah, right, and to help others. Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to this parachute color coding. Tell me more about the way you frame your future at the time, given the workbook you did and...
Gosh, okay.
I know it's many years back, but I'm just trying to get it.
I haven't explained that to anybody in the last 30 years, but okay, let's do it. So the exercise is that you write down all of the things that you love to do. Yeah. You write down all of the things that you're good at. Yeah. And then there, of course, the intersection of what you should, and the impact that you want to make in your life, right? Oh. And then the impact of the three is right, the intersection, of the three comes to what you should do with your life. So what I knew then, because of being I was teaching these classes, sometimes I would have 90 kids, and I would have them for 2-hour periods, and I was only 22 years old. So I saw, I'm good at capturing an audience.
Yes.
So that was my skill set. Yes. And I saw, I'm fascinated by how people are working differently and thinking differently and responding differently in different cultures. So that was my fascination. And then the impact that I wanted to make was, I felt like at that time, there was so little understanding as to how culture intersected with psychology.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see if I could learn something that could help the world with it.
Wow. And I'm sure you had some deep discussion with your parents too, as psychologists, didn't you? No?
I don't know. I mean,
No?
at that time, they were in the U.S. and I was,
And you were in Botswana.
we had no way of communicating with each other.
There was no internet, I guess, at the time.
or cell
no
phones.
Connectivity there, yeah. So let's move forward a little bit, Erin. Then you decided to join the corporate world, and you worked for McKesson, a healthcare services company. Yeah. And later on, you joined Aperian as a country manager for France. Here comes French again, whose mission is to enable individual teams or organizations to work effectively across boundaries and borders. They work on cross-cultural understanding and collaboration in global workplace, providing tools, training to enhance cultural competence. So how much of that particular professional experience opened your eyes on top of the parachute story on the need to master cross-cultural collaboration?
Yeah. So what happened is that I moved back to the U.S. and that's where I met my husband, who is French, and we moved to Paris together. And before we moved, I got this job to come to Paris and to open up the French branch of this cross-cultural consulting firm. And at that time, cross-cultural consulting was basically just expatriates moving from one country to another because we didn't have there was no other connection, right? So what I did, I mean, almost every day was that I worked with a couple who was moving from one country to another, and I would have a country specialist. So the country specialist would be someone from the country that the people were moving to who was living in the country that they were in now, right? So, for example, if I was working with a French couple who was moving, I remember a French couple moving to Wuhan, China. So then I had someone from Wuhan, China who was living here in Paris who would come in, right? So that person is not an expert on cross-cultural consulting, but has lived the experience in the other direction.
I see.
And that was just, so every day I was learning so much from these individuals about their own culture shock, about how they recommended people going into their countries adjust their style to be effective. And I started writing it all down and I wanted to figure out, gosh, there was like, it seems so useful. So I wanted to figure out, was there some way that we could like create some kind of system to help people understand? Because also, and many of these people, of course, were serial expats. So they would go from country to country to country. And it was kind of like, well, can you take the lessons that you learned from one country and which ones of those can you apply as you're going to another country? So that's how I started kind of putting the information together and seeing if there were some patterns that we could come up with. And that was the beginning of the beginning of the research that became the culture map.
We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. I must say I can relate to that because in my whole life, number one, I moved to the US myself with my family many years back when my family was 3 kids, a baby of 2 months, and and basically 4 and 5 years old kids. And I didn't have any preparation for that. But I was working for an American company, so I had a sense. But for my wife, it was pretty wild, and she was speaking a broken English. She was not driving.
Not easy.
Which in the US is something
easy.
like, not really working well. Anyway, I can really appreciate what is that support, that the need for that support, because I also relocated many people across the world. And I remember many discussions I had with the professional, either men or women, and the challenge they had with their family, basically learning the rules or the rituals or the ways to behave in China, in Africa, in Mexico, whatever it was.
That's right.
Very hard.
That's
very
right.
hard. So a wonderful discipline, I think a lot more to do.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back a little bit on, again, both the Peace Corps experience, but also I know you work in the US with Asian migrant communities.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
So in a way, you've been connecting with those migrants.
Yeah.
What unique challenges did you observe among those communities? And as you reflect on this highly sensitive issue of immigration today, whether it is in the US or in France, where you're living now, What would you recommend to our new French Prime Minister when it comes
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, no worries. It's not a political talk. When it comes to migrants integration, because I don't want to get into necessarily a political big discussion, but what does it mean?
Okay. So right. So when I came home from Africa, when I came home from Botswana, before moving to Paris, I ran a school for refugees that were in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. I did that for a couple of years.
Wow.
And the two immigrant and refugee populations in Minnesota,
wow.
were and are still today. The primary ones are Somali and Hmong.
Okay.
So the Hmong are the population that come from Southeast Asia and don't really have a home, right?
Yeah.
So I had. And what I did was I had like these volunteers who were mostly teachers. They were volunteers, and I would. The classes were made up of half Hmong and half Somali because that's who we had.
It's an interesting mix.
Before I give advice to the French president,
let's start with that.
Let me start there. So that was actually just amazing because the Somali culture is a very emotionally expressive culture.
Okay.
Like people would speak really loudly and they would laugh loudly, and like when things were happening that they would enjoy, they would like pound on the table or they would like get up and kind of like
physically
pace around.
Touching others as well.
They would hug each other,
hug
hug me when they saw me, right? And then the Hmong culture is this like very soft culture, right? Where people speak very softly, they never interrupt each other. They're very thoughtful. They don't speak without preparing first. Wow. So already, I mean, like of course now I teach leaders like think in your meetings about why some cultures are talking so much and why you're not hearing from others at all. Right. So in any case, I mean, that was actually something that marked me, those classrooms. Okay, but go on to now.
Back to the big issue of migration.
The big issue of immigration.
Yes.
So I do believe it's quite important, like if we think about these people coming in from all of these different countries, because of course they bring all of their, not just their values with them, but their behaviors, which we misinterpret.
Yes.
Right. So we may misinterpret one behavior as being arrogant or being inappropriate. And I do believe when we're thinking about like, okay, let's just think about the French classroom. It's so important to think about, okay, how can we both keep our own culture present? That's like your corporate culture later on, right?
That's right.
And then, but also be open-minded and respectful and understanding of the cultures that are coming in. And I would really recommend that teachers, and it's actually something I've worked on quite a bit now, after the culture map came out, is helping teachers in international environments understand why when they walk in the classroom, some populations, they stand up, right? Because that is, respect from their heart towards the teacher. And from other cultures, like, what are you doing? Right? So I believe that creates a lot of richness, but also a lot of complexity. Okay, well, that's not really advice, but okay, there you go. Something to think about.
So maybe we should come to the point of naming a Ministry of Integration. Who knows?
For example.
But I think there's a lot of lost value in in this process, which is often missed to actually integrate. And it's hard.
That's right.
It takes work. I mean, there's a number of wonderful NGOs that do this work in every country in the world. I know that for a fact in France, Singa and others do that. Yeah. But it's something otherwise that is completely overlooked and completely underestimated.
Shifting our mindset.
Yes. Yep. So let's continue our discussion. Following all those experiences, again, your career eventually brought you to the corporate and academic world together. You became a professor at INSEAD, which for listeners is a leading, of course, global executive education in Fontainebleau, where you've been directing the Leading Across Borders and Cultures programs. So what made you decide finally to dedicate your life to teaching and research and consulting? So it's not just teaching. You do actually a lot of different activities. Yeah. But still, I think, but you should push me back, on one or two main topics, cross-cultural leadership, but also probably organization culture, which we'll come back to later on.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, okay. So picking up where we left off, that I was working with these expatriate families, and I started to take lots of notes. So just like maybe Monday, I'd have a group from Sweden moving to Argentina.
Yep.
Maybe Tuesday, I'd have a group from Indonesia moving to Canada.
Yep.
Right? So I started recognizing through all of the learning I was doing these patterns, right? So what was coming up as critical. And let me say, I mean, it's not like I was the first person to do that. I should be clear. I mean, there were some people who were very foundational researchers in the cross-cultural field.
Who would you name?
Hofstede is the big one, right?
Okay,
So he's this Dutch guy who did this enormous research project, and he looked at value systems of societies, whereas I look at behaviors in business. So I used his research, but I also tried to kind of think about how it would, I was noticing how it was playing out on the ground a little bit more. So in any case, I started seeing things like, what one of the big ones? Oh, one of the big ones is that what we consider to be constructive feedback is so different in different cultures. And what's disrespectful in one culture is completely respectful in another. Or another one, how do we build trust? Yeah. Like in some cultures, it's all about spending time getting to know one another personally, sharing meals together, even if we're just business colleagues. Yeah. And in other cultures, it's all about, have you shown me that you are effective and reliable and consistent? And
count on you, and
what leads me to feel trust? So as I was taking all of these notes, I started to create categories, and then that led me to want to do more research. Okay. And that I actually then started working with INSEAD, and I did my MBA at INSEAD, an executive MBA. Yeah. And as I was doing that, I also had an opportunity to start teaching. Yeah. So then it all came together.
So this is the way you actually frame and define the so-called 8 dimensions of the cultural map as we are teaching, as we are trying to assemble those 8 patterns.
That's right.
How did you decide? Because I'm sure you probably have taken thousands of pages of notes, maybe on OneNote. Who knows what? I don't know which tool you're using. Very useful.
All by pen at that time.
Or maybe just with a notepad and a pen. But how did you decide to make that critical choice of those 8 dimensions? Because I'm sure there were many others that you considered. How do you pick the most defining ones? That's something I want to understand.
But it's amazing. Like the most amazing thing about this is that the same things come up again and again. Like you would think that if I were doing, 4 sessions in a week, that each day we would be like touching on wildly different things, but it always seemed to come back to the same patterns, to the same issues. Yes. Like, I insulted him because I was honest in a way that's appropriate in my culture, but apparently that's not appropriate in their culture. Or I upset him because in my culture, it's totally appropriate to show up 8 minutes late for a meeting. Yeah. But I guess in their culture, if you show up 8 minutes late and you don't call, it's a sign of arrogance. So to tell you the truth, it just, at the time, there were clearly about 8 things, and then I did put a cap on it at 8 because
that's enough. That's a long list enough.
And as you know, I mean, there's all this research. That's why telephone numbers are never more than 8 figures. Very because we can't remember more than 8 things.
So can you? I know you've done that thousands of times. Can you unpack those 8 dimensions and orientate our listeners on the way to think about that cultural map as they manage international people, as they relocate themselves, their families? How do you think about that framework?
Yeah, so I'll explain the framework kind of largely, and then if you want, we could get into some specificities. But okay, so the culture map framework breaks culture down into 8 behavioral scales. Yes. So it looks at things like how do we express disagreement differently in different cultures, or how do we, let's see, which was something I haven't said yet. Well, I have a whole one about implicit versus explicit communication, for example. Yep. And then through about 180,000 interviews that we've now conducted in about 62 countries, we have these countries that are positioned up and down these scales.
Yeah.
So then you can map up, you can look at the position of each of the countries on each of the scales, and you can map them up next to one another.
Yes.
And then you can compare the similarities and differences.
Yes.
And what's so important about the framework is that it's the relative position between the countries that matters, not the absolute position on the scale. And I'll just give you, an example.
Yeah, just a concrete example
Yeah,
of two
so-
nationalities working together.
Yeah, so here one that will be of
Yes.
interest to you. So, like as an American, when I moved to France
Yeah.
24 years ago, I was struck personally
Yeah.
as an American by how hierarchical the culture was here.
Indeed.
So that's something that is very common for Americans, or even more from Scandinavians moving to France. Like, oh, there's so much focus on the who's at what level,
boss,
and
next
and
level
kind
up.
of deferring to the boss. And
Yes.
then I remember distinctly when I was doing research on this element. I remember interviewing this woman, a Chinese woman for Hermes,
Hermes, yeah.
who had moved here, and she said to me, Erin, it's just crazy because French people are so egalitarian.
Yeah.
And she said, they say this, of course they say égalité, fraternité, but they don't just say it, they mean it.
They really mean it.
And then she started giving me these examples. She'd say, like anyone in a French organization can have an opinion, and their opinion is seen as being just as valid as anybody at any other level.
Yeah.
And of course, if we look at what's going on relatively
Yeah.
on my leading scale, we can see that the U.S. is more egalitarian than France,
Yeah.
which is considerably more egalitarian than China.
Than China, yes.
And then if I can
So
just
relative,
that's
yes.
right. And if I can just continue with
Yes.
that, then so to continue with the relativity,
Yeah.
I was in Denmark a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Okay, so Denmark is the most egalitarian country
Yes.
in the world. And compared to Danish people,
Yeah.
to Danish culture, American culture is very hierarchical. And I gave the Danes this in my class, just this quick little exercise. I was only with them for a couple of hours. And I asked them from their experience to position a few countries on the egalitarian to hierarchical scale. And it was like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Japan,
Yes.
the US, and Denmark. And they put Denmark like in the correct place, like way to the egalitarian version. And then they put all of the other countries in the same place.
Same place.
So for them, the U.S. was just as hierarchical as Saudi
Saudi.
Arabia, Nigeria, and Japan.
Great.
So it's all relative. Right?
So can you name the 8 dimensions?
I could.
I know it's long, but I mean, just to give us and maybe just a few comments on each one of those dimensions.
Okay.
If you
All
may.
right. I don't want to get too long.
No,
though, so
I know.
I'll
We
start,
can-
and you
so
can
we'll start.
you
We
can
can-
jump in
yeah,
with
yeah,
your own
yeah,
comments as
yeah,
we go.
yeah.
Okay. So the first one is actually quite a complicated one. It looks at low context versus high context
Yes.
communication, but I'll try to make it simple. So on a simple level, it looks at how much we value explicit communication where we spell things out
Yes.
versus cultures where we speak between the lines and we pick up implicit messages. And of course, often I talk about just linguistically, like the difference between the US, which is super low context culture, and France, which is more high context.
context, yeah.
And of course, you have these words in French like sous-entendu, listen to what I said.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, listen to what I meant, not
meant.
what I said. Right? Or second degré, tu sais,
Yeah.
c'est le deuxième degré. Don't listen to what I meant, listen to what I really meant.
The way you interpret what I said, actually.
That's
Yes.
right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Or Japan,
Yeah.
which is the highest context culture in the world, where
Yes.
they have this expression, kuki yomenai, someone who is unable to read the
Yes.
air.
Read the air.
That's
Yes.
right. So the whole idea that a good communicator in Japan can really pick up all of the unspoken messages, and then a poor communicator is kuki yomenai.
I think you had one interesting anecdote on this one. I can relate. I've been leading Microsoft Japan business for many years in my previous life, Microsoft. And I remember learning, deeply how to connect the culture.
Yeah.
Particularly when I was doing as well some of those kind of whole hands meeting with all the people in the room from the subsidiary, speaking, and then taking questions.
Yeah. Oh, my bright eyes example.
Yeah. And then probably you see where I'm going, Erin.
Yeah.
It's so hard to get the first question. Even in American headquarter company, Microsoft, people are more used to that, but still.
Yeah.
So can you share with us, because I think I had exactly the same common experience as I came back many times per year in Japan, on the way you actually detect who might be ready to ask a question, but who's not going to raise his hand, actually.
Yeah. So that's an example that I had where I gave a presentation in Tokyo, an hour presentation. At the end, I asked if there were any questions. No one raised their hand. Yep. I went to sit down, but I was with my Japanese colleague, and he came up to me and he said, "Oh, I think there were some questions. Would you like me to try?" And I said, "Oh, yes, please." So Taka stood up and he said to the group, "Oh, do you have any questions?" Yeah. No one raised their hand, but he stopped and he silently looked around, and then he gestured to someone who was sitting there, from my perspective, motionless. And he said, "Do you have a question?" And the person said, "Oh, thank you." And he sat up and he asked a fascinating question. And then Taka did that a couple more times. Yes. So afterwards, I said, "But Taka, how did you know that those people had questions?" And he said, "Oh, well, it had to do with how bright their eyes were," right? But actually, he then clarified. He said, "Well, in Japan, we don't make as much direct eye contact as you do in the West. So when I asked if there were any questions, most people weren't looking right at you. Yeah. They were looking somewhere else. But I noticed that there were a couple of people in the room who were looking right at you, and their eyes were bright." And he said, "So look for the eye contact," which was very useful. And I cannot understate how useful that information for me was. So the next day I gave another presentation. Again, I asked if there were any questions. Again, no one raised their hand, but I did what he had suggested. I stopped and I looked around. People were looking at me softly, let's say. But there was someone in the room who grabbed me with his eyes. That's as well as I can explain it. Like, he looked at me and he held my gaze. Wow. And when I looked at him, he kept the eye contact. So then I was like, does he have bright eyes? So I made a little gesture because I didn't want to take too much risk, and he nodded his head. Of course. Do you have a question? Oh, I do. So the important part of that story is that when I got back to INSEAD, where I teach these incredibly international classrooms, I saw there were all of these bright eyes surrounding me, not just from the Japanese. And that my own American assumption that if someone had something to say, they would raise their hand, was completely blocking all of this input in the class. Yeah. So, okay, that's my bright eyes.
It makes me think about certainly the way you pick up those nonverbal cues. And as you know, I mean, everyone has been studying that 90% of our communication is nonverbal. Yeah. And I think it's even more important in a cross-cultural environment.
Yeah.
And that's why, as well, we may discuss that a bit later, of course, digital communication, the Teams and Zoom calls don't necessarily help because you're missing the body language, even the bright eyes, kind of.
A little bit complicated. But I want to give you a brand new example. Since you asked me to give you a really old example, people are going to be like, Erin's always giving that bright eyes example. So let me give a brand new one from last week. Okay. So this one shows if Japanese people are looking for bright eyes, this one shows the American style of spell it out. Okay. So let me first start by talking about sense of humor.
Yeah.
Okay, so first let's just mention that the U.S. is the lowest context culture in the world, and that is largely because we are a country of immigrants. Yeah. So Japan, a homogeneous society, thousands of years of shared history. So people have a lot of experience reading one another's body language and nonverbals. Yes. The U.S. just a couple hundred years ago, we came from all over the place. We have different histories, different languages. So we learned we really have to dumb things down in our communication and spell things out. So like a simple example, this is not the new part, but a simple example has to do with sense of humor. So like I was in the UK a while ago, and when I'm with British people, they're always saying things. I think it's a joke. joke, but I'm not sure, so I don't dare laugh. And I'm always saying, if you could please do what we do in the U.S., which is when we make a joke, we put a label on it, right? So we make the joke, and then we say, just kidding, right? And then they know they can laugh. Okay, so I told this story last week, and I had this Italian guy in my class who was living in Silicon Valley. Okay, he's living in the U.S. So Masa says, he said, when I told this thing about just kidding, he said, no, Erin, that's not the end of the story. And I said, okay, well, what's the end of the story? He said, well, in Italy, if you make a joke and the other person thinks it's funny, then they laugh. Okay, logical. He said, but in the U.S., if you make a joke and the other person thinks it's funny, then they say, that's funny.
It is so funny.
That's hysterical. And I said to him, because I never thought of this, right? So I said, oh, you're right. We laugh and we say that's funny. And he said, no, Erin, I've been observing this carefully. The laughter is optional. Which actually on reflection is true, right? So I said, that's funny.
Wonderful. Any other dimension you'd like to outline again for our listeners quickly, a couple of them that you believe are critical as well?
Well, maybe we should talk about expressing disagreement.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's an important one.
I think that's a good one because we haven't mentioned it yet. And here you are from France, having lived in the U.S., and here I am from the U.S., having lived in France. And this is such an important one in our cultures and in many cultures. So, of course, in your culture, you learn really, like in your education system, to debate. Right.
We love debate.
You love debate. And of course, that comes from Descartes, the system or method of systematic doubt. Right. So if you say something, then I should express doubt in order to have a debate to lead to a good outcome.
Yes.
Right. So it's very appropriate to in French culture, for example, to say, no, I completely disagree with that, or I'm absolutely not. Right. And of course, that doesn't have any kind of negative impact. Right. But in so many cultures in the world, expressing open disagreement is really seen as disrespectful, or like you don't like me, or you're
personal.
You take it really personally. I remember moving here to France, and I would well, even in my classrooms, but I would go into these meetings and like I'd be outlining an idea, and someone would say, oh no, je ne suis pas d'accord, I disagree with you. And for me, like even the word disagree it's quite aggressive.
Yeah, it was aggressive, offensive.
Right. So that's quite an interesting dimension because of course we might just be having a discussion. And of course Americans are quite confrontational in comparison to Latin American cultures or to Eastern European cultures. So I think just thinking about how much debate is seen as appropriate in a meeting, and then what's the best way to frame that debate so that people see that as constructive, not as an attack, is such an important skill for anyone working in an international situation.
No, I love it. Let's bring that into your real life example, Erin, if I may, right?
Sure, of course.
I mean, you've been relocated in France a couple of decades ago, right? You raise your kids in France. You were born in France, and your husband is French.
Yeah.
So how should I think about you two as parents raising your kids in terms of disagreement with your kids, in terms of your education philosophy? Do you play it as like the good cop and the bad cop? The good guy and the bad guy? How does it work?
Wouldn't it be nice if we were like really strategic like that, really aligned? Aren't we all really aligned?
How did it work? How did you figure that out?
But I do think that's like such an interesting element because sometimes people will say to me, Erin, aren't cultural differences becoming less important in the workplace as we have more and more experience working with people from other countries and as we become more internationally connected? And I actually believe deeply that although that may be true on some kind of minor level, that the cultures across the world will remain different as long as the way that we educate our children is so different from one part of the world to the other. And I mean educate as far as the classroom goes, but also educate as far as how we parent goes. And I think for any of our listeners who are in multicultural marriages, you know, the most difficult thing is that what we consider good parenting is so fundamentally different in one country than another. And I mean,
so how did you deal with that with your husband? Did you had a kind of big meeting at one point?
I mean, we deal with it all.
How do we align? How do we unify?
Like, I don't know. Like, I would love to say that it just worked out smoothly, but in truth, it's like deeply complicated. And like, so just an example that comes into my head. And let me say that. So I'm American, and I have lived in France now 24 years, and my husband is French, but he lived in the U.S. for almost 20 years. So we are sort of the opposite of one another. Yes. But of course, he was raised in a French family. And I was raised in an American family. And one of the big issues that we had when the children were little is that we would bring the kids to my mother-in-law's house, to my French, my husband's French family. And in the U.S., we just, we have such a strong idea about giving your children lots of freedom so that they can turn into their own selves. Yes. And of course, in France, you have this idea of having children who are, well cadré, right? You have that
and protected,
and behave in a way that's appropriate. Yes. So I just that was deeply difficult because
to accept.
And Eric's parents would be like, I can't believe the way they behave, the way that Erin just lets the children behave like that. And of course, to me, it was like, well, don't shout at the children. Children shouldn't be shouted at, right? And even that's so interesting. Yes. Like my American friends, I was just speaking to my close friend from when I was a child, and she was like, oh, I feel so horrible because I shouted at my son yesterday. And I was like, Linnea, you know what? He'll be fine. And I said, people here, they shout at the kids all the time and they all turn out great. Right? So in any case, it's challenging, right?
No, very interesting story. I know we have many listeners as well across culture, so I think I'm sure they'll pick their own stories. Now, moving to the professional world, I've been myself growing professionally in an American company for 40 years, a wonderful company, Microsoft, and I've been running the global business for many years, traveling, for 30 years of my life to 120 countries. And over the past 8 years, I was working alongside Satya Nadella, the new CEO. And I had the opportunity to lead some amazing team, composed of basically Egyptians, Brazilians, Americans, Spanish, British, Germans, Chinese, Japanese. I mean, so many nationalities. So let's imagine that I'm starting all over again, right? This is Jean-Philippe, JP, like 30 years ago. I'm gonna be appointed to take on that global business. What would be your coaching? What would be your advice to me, Erin, as I think about this global business and this global organization made up 120 subsidiaries, 35,000 people? How should I deal with that?
Yeah. So my main overriding advice is that you should get a conversation started. And it amazes me how little people talk about this topic in international companies. And I believe the reason that we don't talk about it is that on the one hand, people worry that if we bring up cultural differences, that leads to stereotyping and putting individuals in boxes. Yes. Yet if we don't talk about cultural differences, then we all end up running around viewing everybody's behavior from our own lens. Yes. The Japanese person who doesn't speak up in the meeting, he has nothing to contribute, right? Or like the French guy who starts a debate, he's always attacking everybody, right? So we need to, but first of all, be able to separate individuals from cultures so we can have a discussion. Yes. So we can recognize, on the one hand, every individual is different. Even if we come from the same block, the same family, of course, we are all unique. On the other hand, we are all the same. We are the same animal. We feel envy. We feel we have adrenaline that floods through our body when we're excited.
Oxytocin, et cetera.
Right? Of course, we are all the same, but we all come from somewhere, or maybe somewheres if you come from different countries. And where we come from and how we were raised and the companies that we have worked for, they impact what we see as being effective and ineffective, constructive, destructive. So we need to get a conversation started.
So how do you do that?
So
what does it look like, the conversation? Let's imagine I've got those 15 guys, my 15 leaders from 15 different countries, and I'm having my first meeting with all of them. What should I do?
Well, so what I always recommend, I mean, of course, I'm going to talk about the way that I would do this with my culture map framework, but I don't think it has to be done around the culture map framework. But, what I like to have people do is do like a personal assessment so they can respond to questions about themselves, right? And then they can have themselves mapped on these different scales. And then you can also map out countries. So then you can say, oh, well, look, I'm Egyptian. Here's where when it comes to negative feedback, in my culture, we are not very direct. Okay, not as indirect as Indonesia, but compared to the Europeans on the team, clearly we don't like to state the criticism directly. Yet I, as and I can help you if you're working with Egypt. I can help you give the feedback and understand
in a way that is understandable.
Now, that being said, I, as an individual, I lived in the Netherlands from age 10 to 20, and I am more direct in my style than almost all of the other cultures represented on the team, right? So I think having that kind of discussion, it's like, oh, we have so much to learn from one another, and we never assume that an individual is like a culture, and therefore we can discuss with richness, right?
So it's really about decoding each one of the persons one by one, both from a cultural standpoint, nationalities, country, but also where do they come from, as you said, because everyone is unique, but understanding not the boundaries, but the ways they've been growing up, what's offensive, what's supportive, what's working and not with them. That would be a great way to start communicating effectively, I guess.
And not being afraid to ask questions.
Candid questions.
People
I don't know.
People don't bring it up because they think, oh, well, if I ask him a question about Egypt, he's going to think that I'm stereotyping. But everyone loves to talk about culture as long as you use humble words to describe your own culture. Laugh at your own culture. Always great, right? And you use positive words to describe the other culture. I actually have a great example from just a couple of days ago. So, one thing I've been looking at more at is positive feedback. How much we express open recognition in different cultures. And I had this German woman who was working on a team with a bunch of Americans, and she said to one of the Americans in the group, I've noticed, so again, humble or negative words to describe your own culture and positive words to describe the other culture. So she said, I've noticed that in the U.S., you're really good at appreciating one another openly, something that we don't do much of in my own culture. She said, but, I get confused because when our American boss singles out an individual for praise in front of the group, is he signaling to me that he's not happy with my work when he praises the other person openly? And that American, because she framed it in a positive way, was able to say, oh, no, not at all. That's something we love, and it comes from our education system. So just ask the questions.
Great example. You're back at the pleasure on the podcast again to host Stephen M. R. Covey. He's the bestseller author of a great book, Trust and Inspire, or Truly Great Leaders Unleash Greatness in Others. In our discussion, he shared with us how building trust is both an art and a science that requires self-awareness, clear communication, and consistent behavior. So, Erin, can we have a bit of dialogue on what does it take to build trust with international teams? We just started a discussion. Can you help us working through our self-awareness, our communication as well, and our behaviors one person and one nationality at a time, which is a bit of a discussion we're just starting to have.
Yeah, thank you. So I think actually the most important of my 8 dimensions is the trusting scale.
Trust.
It's a pretty simple dimension to understand in comparison to some of the others, but it breaks culture down into two types. So we have what we call cognitive trust, trust from my brain. So I see you are on time, you do good work, you're reliable, I trust you. And then we have what we call affective trust, trust from my heart. I feel an emotional bond with you or a personal connection. I feel like I've seen who you are inside. And because I've seen who you are inside, I trust you. So, of course, if I ask you why you trust your mother, it doesn't matter where you come from. We all talk about affective trust. But if I ask you why you trust a business partner or a colleague, we'll see a lot more difference from one part of the world to another. So many cultures, like my own, so the U.S. culture or Northern European cultures, where we tend to really separate like cognitive trust for work and effective trust for home. It doesn't mean that we don't want to work with people that we like, but it means that we don't invest a lot of time in getting to know people personally. Right.
And as you know super well, of course, depending on the cultures, sometimes it's not really well received to invite for that personal, real connection.
And in fact, it may be seen as dangerous, right? It may be seen like, well, we should be really friendly with one another, but we don't want to we have a clear boundary. We're not going to let people that we work with in deeply because then we arrive with a conflict of interest. And then, of course, we have many other cultures in the world, all Latin American cultures, almost all African countries, the vast majority of Asia, where cultures tend to be much more focused on kind of weaving together this cognitive and affective trust all together.
Maybe building on that a little bit more, I would like you to talk a bit about self-awareness, because I think when it comes again to positive leadership, it's one of the foundations to be aware of yourself, to get to know yourself, which is so hard, right? So how do you translate that again across boundaries, nationalities, self-awareness?
Well, I think that that's actually a great moment to ask that question because when I talk about this dimension of trust, people who come from task-oriented cultures, they always complain. They'll say, well, it's not true. Relationships are really important in my culture too. And of course, I do believe that humans are relationship-oriented. But when we start kind of looking at people's behaviors, we can see, actually more self-reflection is needed. And maybe I'll just give a simple example, a recent example. So I was doing some work with an American Indian collaboration, and things were not going well at all. And I spoke with these American managers who were like overseeing this group in India. And I said to them, have you taken the time to build trust and get to know them personally? And they said, yes. They said, we have a great relationship. We connect very well with them. We went to visit them. Things are great, right? But when I worked with the Indian group, I learned something different. And I remember talking to one of the senior Indian guys in the group, and he said, we have this problem because, of course, we know here in Bangalore, we know that Americans, when they start a conversation, they say, how are you? And the other person says, I'm great. How are you? Fine. Right?
That's it. We're done with that.
Right. So he said, so we do that too. So they say to us, how are you? And we say, we're great. How are you? Or how was your weekend? It was fabulous. Thank you. Let's get down to business.
Let's get to the business,
And he said, but for us here in Bangalore, we can't really trust somebody unless we feel like they know us, not just us as individuals, but they know what's going on with our children. They understand the issues that we're having with our mother who's sick or whatever, the wedding that's going on, whatever. And so he gave a very simple recommendation. He said, so when you, if the senior Americans, when you're on the phone and you say, how are you? And your Indian team member says, oh, I'm great, thanks, how are you? Just stop and say, no, but how are you?
Really?
Yeah, like
Yes.
really, how
Yeah.
are you?
Yeah.
And then if you do that every call, and then also tell them something about you, like how are you? And he gave another recommendation that I loved: get rid of the virtual backgrounds.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Get rid of the virtual backgrounds. Put some personal stuff about your kids and
Your
your
real-
family
real
behind
life.
you,
Yep,
right?
yep, yep.
And then, okay, now we can get a conversation started. So your question was, how do we,
Yes.
how important is self-awareness? And I do believe we say, when it comes to culture, fish don't see water. And often if we are in a culture and of a culture, we don't even recognize how others view our cultures, which is why having this
Yes.
kind of reflection is so important.
No, I think it's so important. It makes me think about another great guest I had, which is a friend of mine, Michael Bungestani, who wrote this wonderful book about coaching habits. And the first question is, what is on your mind, Erin? And what else? And what else? And what else? So stop there. But
Love it. Yeah.
It's really
Same
all
thing.
about getting into that personal connection, really, meaning it, not just superficially. Now, I'd like to shift gears and talk about communication. I recently, actually, late December, had a great discussion with Charles Duhigg, the bestseller author of The Power of Habits. In his recent book called Super Communicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection, he identified three primary types of conversations that are essential for effective communications. Practical conversations, what this is really about. Emotional conversations, how do we feel? And social conversations, who are we? So do you agree with that conversation taxonomy? And do you really have the same three types of conversations across cultures? I know it's a pretty big question. So the practical conversations, the emotional conversations, and the social conversations.
Yeah, so I do believe, when we talk about, I talk sometimes about the head, the hand, and the heart, right?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe that's the same thing, right? So that when we're working internationally, we have three things that are going on. So the first has to do with our cognition, right? That's the head. The hand, that has to do with how we are actually doing the work,
things,
right?
Yeah.
And then the heart, how we feel about what we're doing.
Yeah.
And culture impacts all three of those things: our cognitive patterns, our emotional reactions, and also our behaviors. Right. So I think that's same thing.
That's a nice way to embrace it. No, I'd like to finish on that cultural map discussion, or you could spend so many hours, but the time is going pretty fast. And coming back to another guest, which I know you know well, Daniel Goleman, on emotional intelligence. So I'd like to get your basically viewpoint on the way you think about emotional intelligence and the way it should complement some of the cross-cultural intelligence for today's global leadership.
Yeah.
Does it matter?
Yeah. So people will often say to me, if you're emotionally intelligent, must you be emotionally intelligent to be a good international leader?
Yeah.
And I would say yes, but it's not enough, because you can be extremely emotionally intelligent in your own culture, but not be able to recognize the signals that are coming at you from another culture. So I believe it's critical for anyone who's in a global leadership role that they are stretching themselves to challenge their own ways of understanding communication patterns and to move beyond it. And I think maybe just a really simple one. We talked earlier, you asked me that example about the bright eyes. One thing that comes up so often, and I think you had this at Microsoft too, but what happens so often is in American companies, we often talk a lot about the importance of speaking up.
Yes.
Right. So that's a very strong American belief that if you come to a meeting, you better say something.
Yes.
And that, of course, comes from the American education system, where we have a participation grade in our school.
The school.
And in as a child growing up in the U.S., I had my hand almost raised even before I knew what the question was. That's true.
It was behavior.
Because
it was a habit.
I knew
too.
that if I had my hand raised first, I would get called on and I would get extra credit, which means, and it's true, that what was important was that I said something.
Yes.
Not that what I said was the highest
Yeah,
quality or the most thought
It
through.
was not to be about the smartest in the room, but actually participate.
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 So different than the
Yes.
vast majority
Many
of
cultures.
school systems.
Oh, yeah. Particularly French ones, right?
Yeah,
I'm sure your kids, you're
course,
careful. Because
you only speak if you've really thought through, because
yeah.
otherwise you're going to get in trouble. But I mean, let's just look at like
Yeah.
all of Asia. Oh my
Yes.
gosh,
Oh,
like
yeah.
where we don't even really talk, unless we've really prepared, right?
Yes.
So of course, then if you go to a meeting and you're like, oh well, you're not speaking up, so you're not showing leadership skills.
Yes.
That leads to an incredible bias as to what good leadership is and how we get people into the right positions.
Yeah.
So in any case, I can't remember what the question was anymore, but I'm sure that was the answer.
No, absolutely. So let's move now to this great book that you published in 2020, Erin, No Rules, Netflix and the Cultural Reinvention, a book that you co-authored with Reed Hastings, the co-founder and former CEO of Netflix. In your book, you talk about Netflix culture, which is a culture of no rules, a culture built on context as opposed to controls, and a high-performance culture built to attract and retain talents.
Yeah.
Can you unpack the key traits of this unique culture and tell us if you believe it can sustain over time?
Yeah, right. So starting in 2017, when Netflix was still 2017, Netflix was just newly working outside of the U.S.
Yeah.
I started doing this big research project with Reed Hastings, with the founder of Netflix, the CEO at that time, on understanding their organizational culture and how that organizational culture would work around the world.
Yep.
And then eventually we wrote a book to help other people who are entrepreneurs or running creative companies to think about how to get an organizational culture that fostered innovation and flexibility. And I was very interested in this company because I think they actually had about the most disruptive organizational culture of our time, really something quite unusual. And there were three primary tenets, which when people say, we want to have an entrepreneurial spirit, I think this is actually what they mean, right? So number one, you want high talent density.
Yes.
So high talent density means that we have less employees, but only really, or as much as possible, really good ones.
The top-notch
so of course
people.
you have a limited budget.
Yeah.
So use your limited budget to hire 10% of the employees and pay them, if necessary, up to 10 times the amount to get really, really good ones.
Because the density of talents makes a big difference.
Because once you've got really high talent density, then you can have a lot less rules, policies, and processes because really good people generally don't need to be controlled so much.
Right. That's
okay,
right.
so that's step one.
Yep.
Step two is that then you create a culture of candid feedback.
Radical feedback, I think you call that, right?
Radical candor.
Radical candor.
Radical candor. Yeah, that's right. And now we've got a lot of companies using that term, but at the time it was the first time I'd heard it.
So let's express what is radical candor.
So radical candor means that whatever you feel someone else could do to improve their work, you tell them. And it might not sound so radical, but you know what it is.
It makes a difference, yes.
I actually, I'll just tell a quick story. I know it's full of stories, but the first time that I was presenting at Netflix on the culture map, someone came up to me during a break, and she was with a group of other people, and she gave me feedback about what I could do in order to improve my presentation right in the middle of the presentation, like I was off stage. She said to me, the way that you're facilitating the discussion from the stage is undermining your point. And she was right. She said, because you're asking people to raise their hand and only Americans are raising their hand. So, and she gave me back my feedback from the book. And then I was able to improve my presentation based on it. But it didn't feel very good.
Of course,
right?
Of course.
So that's the second point, which is as long as the feedback aims to assist and is actionable, that we say what's ever on our mind.
Yes.
And the deal with that is that once we have really strong talent density, that if we can get all of this constructive feedback going and people really saying exactly what they think, it boosts talent density higher. High performance gets
Yes.
stronger.
Yes.
And once you've got this, as one person said to me at Netflix, a garden of excellence.
A god of excellence. Wow. Okay.
Once you've got this environment where you've got like this extreme high performance, the thing is that then you can give people immense amounts of freedom. So really, like all of these policies, processes, rules, even things like KPIs or management by objective, you can just like release those control mechanisms and let your employees run a lot more free.
Yeah.
And that's what creates this kind of like, well, as Reed said to me once, operating on the edge of chaos. But of course, if you've got all of that kind of like freedom going, I do believe that's where innovation lives. Yes. And of course, much more flexibility. Yes. Right. So that's the three things we need. Yeah.
So let's dig a little bit more into this context, not control. I think at Netflix, you observe that leaders provide employees, again, with a clear understanding of the goals, broader strategy, the context, but then allow them to determine how to achieve these objectives, which obviously minimize bureaucracy and empower decision-making. So likewise, is this a leadership style that you would encourage other companies to follow, or is it something just too unique to Netflix to imitate?
Okay. So let me, so they say two things, right? Lead with context, not control.
Yes.
And don't seek to please your boss.
It's an important addition, actually. Yes.
Seek to do what's right for the company.
For the company,
right?
Yes.
And then just like a couple little samples, things like that. I mean, like the expense policy is spend money in the company's best interest, right? And then the manager should be setting context as to what would be like to spend money in the company's best interest. But there's not rules telling people how much money they can spend
when you travel abroad, blah blah blah,
or how you need to get things signed off.
Yes.
So the question that you need to ask yourself, if you are ready for this, is in your organization or in your team, is innovation more important than error elimination? Because innovation and error elimination are in tension with one another. And maybe I'll say like my kind of overarching learning from all of this research at Netflix was to recognize how the vast majority of companies today are operating with an industrial era hangover. And of course, during the industrial era, we were all obsessed with error elimination, consistency, and replicability. And if you are leading a manufacturing plant today, if you are working in a safety critical industry, please keep following the rules of the industrial era. But so that's if error elimination is more important to you. But if innovation, creativity, fresh thinking, agility, flexibility is more important than error elimination, then follow the method, right? Then you want to go for employee freedom, which requires talent density and requires candor.
Yes.
Right.
So let's move on. It's been 2 years since Reed Hastings stepped down as the CEO of Netflix, passing the baton to two co-CEOs, Ted Sarandos and Greg Peters. How much of a change did you notice from the outside or maybe from the inside? I don't know if you still work with them. With Netflix leadership style, and to what extent you believe they feel the need to revisit the culture.
So I have not done research since then,
recently,
so I can't really speak from a very internal perspective. But I will say that both Ted and Greg, who took over from Reed, and Reed's still the chairman, right? But they had been with the company for decades, and they were two individuals who had a very deep understanding of what that cultural ethos was. And I believe when Reed moved over to let them take on that position, he chose people who he knew had the culture in their fabric. In the fabric, right? So those three elements that we've just outlined, I mean, talent density, candor, and freedom, they are still the leading drivers in the company. And I mean, I don't know if you've been looking at it, but I was just looking at Netflix stock a few days ago, and it's amazing. I can't believe it. I can't believe how from 2017 when I started working working there to like where it is today. Oh my gosh. And I really do believe that it's because they've managed to flip the decision-making methodology on its head. And I'll just give one image of that. So like the vast majority of companies today, I mean, always have been operating like a pyramid. So you've got the chairman at the top and the lower level employees are at the bottom. The lower level employees can make small, unimportant, inexpensive decisions. But for anything important, you have to push it up the pyramid. Right? And of course, we all know the pyramid. But in these, I think, remarkable companies today where they're trying to adjust to our new reality and where we realize in these companies innovation is more important than error elimination, that now, I mean, Netflix is using a decision-making tree. And the thing about the tree is that the chairman of the tree is in the dirt. Not at the top of the pyramid. Setting,
at
as
the
you
roots
said,
of the tree,
setting the context. This is our North Star. This is the way we're running. Here's the culture that will drive the decision-making throughout the organization. It only works if you have a culture-driven organization.
For sure.
And then, of course, as you get up the tree, you have actually the lower-level managers who are often making huge, expensive decisions.
Absolutely.
At Netflix, I saw lower-level managers making multi-million-dollar decisions for the organization. Not saying, boss, can I or can't I?
Just do it.
But keeping in mind all of the context that had been set for them. So if there's any reason that company's been so successful, I do believe it's because they got that tree so healthy. Now, have adjustments been made? I'm sure the context has changed as the company has grown so large.
No, I love it a lot. You know, Microsoft, one of the key tenets of the culture, culture, is starting with actually clarity. And clarity, to me, connects actually quite deeply with the context. You're here as a leader to bring clarity, to simplify, to provide some, I would say, some background and some support, but you're not here actually to give the list of things to do in details, because you want to actually bring some more comfort to the people so that they can take on their own some new challenges and so on and so forth. So anyway, a lot more on the culture of the companies. Now, moving on to the very last couple of questions, Erin. Earlier on the podcast, I had the pleasure of welcoming Kim Cameron, that you may know, world-renowned scholar and best-selling author on cultural change and positive leadership in organization. He shared some valuable insights on how vulnerability is a critical component in building trust within teams, which he believes is essential for fostering a high-performing environment. So considering your work with leadership cultures, do you see vulnerability playing a role in the companies you've studied, particularly in creating environments where people feel safe to take risks and innovate? And does it travel the world as well to show vulnerability as the leader?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. It is human psychology that when someone is vulnerable, shows vulnerability with us, that we feel more trust from them if they've already shown us high levels of competency. And that's critical. I mean, that's like super interesting research that shows there's actually this very, very interesting, like it's an old study, but it showed that the study was that they're like interviewing you have groups of people who are the research pool, the people who are the research candidates, and they're interviewing people for a job. And if the person they're interviewing has shown them to have high levels of competency and effectiveness, and then they make a mistake. So in the research, that person would spill their coffee all over, right? And then they would say, "Oh my gosh, I spilled my coffee everywhere." If they were shown to have high levels of skill and competency, and then they showed vulnerability by reacting openly and explaining what was going on, that boosted the level of trust that the people being researched had for them significantly. Yet, people who had not demonstrated high levels of competency, people who seemed to be rather incompetent or ineffective, when they showed vulnerability,
on the contrary,
it made their the trust for them plummet.
Wow.
So I think that's something important, because I don't actually, this is a side of the cross-cultural question, but I don't actually think that you want people who are like brand new, who haven't shown that they're good at what they do yet, walking around talking openly about all their mistakes and failures. But if we can get to a level that we've shown some cognitive effectiveness and built some of that trust, then we want to show high levels of vulnerability.
No, it's fascinating because very often these days, in the last couple of years, we heard about vulnerability as a key foundation for any leader. And you're so right that if you have not been able to demonstrate any competence, actually it might not help you at all.
Well, people just don't want to hear any more of it, right?
No addition and confirmed by research. Really coming to the last couple of questions on positive leadership, because as you know, the core concept of this podcast, how do you think positive leadership ties into cross-cultural leadership, particularly in today's globalized world, or maybe deglobalized world? Let's see where the politics gets us. So what do you think about the positive leadership translating across boundaries?
Yeah, well, I do believe that positive energy is something that is human. And if you are someone who comes with a lot of positive energy, already you can inspire your teams around the world, of course. Yes. And then if we can add a level of cross-cultural awareness, then you can bring your positive energy to also increase diverse perspectives. And let's just give like a super simple example. But okay, we gave that bright eyes example earlier, and you made a comment afterwards that was quite interesting. You said, but of course, if we're working at a distance, we might not be able to read people's bright eyes. But I just saw a leader do this a few weeks ago. He was aware of all these things. We were on a Zoom meeting, and what he recognized was that while, in some cultures they're interrupting one another, and in other cultures they feel they all have to speak, that in some of the cultures people would suggest that they had something to say by unmuting themselves or by leaning forward or opening their mouths. So he was then like the orchestra conductor, right? He was saying, I think Chen, that you have something that you'd like to say. You unmuted yourself, and then, yes, thank you.
Please go
right?
ahead.
Or yes, Marianne, that was fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. Now let me hear from someone over here. And I do believe that if we have that cross-cultural facilitation skills, that we can then bring our positivity to also lead to more diversity of opinion, to hear the voice of diversity in our teams.
No, I love it. And I love the way you brought together again that basically positivity, positive mindset, and cross-cultural awareness, and the way it drives a more inclusive environment. So what is now your own definition of positive leader, Erin? Who is that person? How do you define that person, that positive leader?
I believe that one thing that we have not talked enough about yet with leadership just has to do with the energy that pours out of us. And it amazes me when I see people who have this kind of like strong positive energy, how that then impacts the energy of the team. So I've been doing a lot of work with organizational culture lately, and of course companies will say, we've been trying to change our organizational culture, but we're not able to do it. And you can't change your organizational culture if you don't change your own behavior. And it's so hard to change our own behavior. And because it's so hard to change our own behavior, it's so hard to change the culture of the culture of the company. But if you want more positivity in your organization, yet you as an individual don't show positivity in your own spirit, it's never going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
So
yes.
I think that's just a simple message. Like, let me just give a quick example. Like, if you're on and on about we need to be more customer focused, yet you as a leader are not out there on a weekly basis shaking hands with your customers, or you're not putting customer satisfaction on the majority of your agendas, it's not going to happen.
No.
Right? So it has to start with you.
For sure.
Yeah. Culture starts with you.
I love it because I think it has to be so personal. It has to come from the inside of each one of the people and leaders to change and shape a change in the culture of an organization. No, my really last question. A few months back, actually, I hosted Yoshito Ori, who is a wonderful Japanese leader who had an MBA in the US, and then he built the largest kind of MBA in Asia. Globally, he's also running a private equity. Anyway, a very interesting, I would say, dual mindset between the US and Japan altogether. And we talked about the importance of empowering younger generations in leadership roles and providing them with the tools to succeed in a globalized world. So as a final question, looking toward the future, what would be your key advice for young, upcoming leaders to thrive in an increasingly diverse and multipolar geopolitical world?
Yeah. So, one of the fascinating things that happened after COVID, of course, is that people found themselves in these situations. So many of us did, where maybe previously you were mostly working with people from your own culture, and now you get up in the morning, you open up Zoom or Teams, and you have a box on your screen, and each box is someone in a different country. And it's so easy when we're not actually traveling to other cultures to not recognize what's cultural and what's personal, instead to assume that everything has to do with that individual. But just because we're in more frequent contact with people from other countries, it doesn't mean that we are more culturally aware or sophisticated.
Agreed.
In fact, I would say that if most of your interaction with other cultures is at a distance, you're probably mistaking a lot of behaviors as individual attributes that are cultural attributes. So my main recommendation is, don't forget to go visit the countries you're working with.
Get on the ground.
Get on the ground.
Meet
go
the people.
live in other
Live
countries.
Yes.
And if you can't do it, at least show curiosity and ask questions. And in doing so, we can all become on an ongoing basis more effective dealing with this extremely complex multicultural world that we're working in. And I guess my last comment is, for anyone who says, I don't need to learn about this stuff because I've already lived in a bunch of different countries. And I hear that, whenever I hear that, I'm just like, oh my gosh.
It's called the fixed mindset, right?
Because the world is so complex and fascinating that I think we know that the more you know you don't know. And that's what makes this world so fascinating to work in.
Love it as a closing, Erin. Be curious and again, get on the ground to live some real shared experiences with real people across the world.
That's right.
Erin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Your experiences and insights are incredibly valuable and vibrating as well. I'm sure listeners have learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining us. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this one, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and the other platform. I'd love to have your 5 stars and ratings and feedback. Candid feedback always, obviously. Stay tuned for our next episode where we continue to explore positive leadership in action with more incredible guests. Take care. Thank you so much again, Erin.
Thank you. Great to be here.